without the other. Secondly, the world needs a governance mechanism to facilitate the interdependence that we now see globally. And without that, it is like having a country that will not enforce its powers of governance on parts of the country. And therefore, if you're only governing a part of the country, you're leaving the rest exposed. The planet needs global governance, not in a big stick way, but in a simple way of us cooperating with each other to be able to work with the institutions that we have. Similarly, we did not see the level of recapitalization of the GCF. We want to give thanks for that. And I really do want to salute the UAE for the establishment of the Altera Fund at 30 billion, with a view to being able to scale that up to 250 billion. The truth is that private sector funding is going to be critical, but we all know that there are a number of things that need to be done to make that fair and level. Unless we lower and level the cost of debt to the global south, we're going to continue with countries not being able to benefit in real terms, which means deconstructing the foreign exchange risk and trying to put a proper price on it rather than overcharging it. Deconstructing the unconscious bias, and we all know it still exists. So let us not bury our heads in the sand about that. We need, therefore, to bring the bank regulators to the table who continue to perhaps put rules that they think are benign but have deleterious impact because of the lack of structures and institutions in the global south. And secondly, we need to bring the credit rating agencies to the table because their judgments also are restricting the decisions of a lot of these development banks and other institutions from doing the things that they could otherwise do. Why are these things urgent? Because the destination is not finance. The destination is actually adaptation. The destination is actually recovery from loss and damage. The destination is actually mitigation, which is why we're calling for a global methane agreement and not simply voluntary compliance. And we thank Dr. Sultan for the voluntary mechanism that he has gotten 50 companies to put in place. But there's still large companies like Chevron and others that are not at the table. And therefore, unless there is a global methane agreement that is compulsory, we are not going to get where we need to go. We thank the World Bank and its president for also recognizing that they need to fund the other aspects of the control of methane. For example, the livestock farming, the farming in rice paddies, and waste management. If we can do those things, methane control is the quickest way to controlling the increase in temperature. And the reality is that we need to make that common knowledge. The science is clear, clear, clear. If you want to be able to turn down the heat, you've got to control methane emissions. So I'll stop here, not because I don't have more to say, but because I believe that others have better to say. And Lord Stern is far more qualified than I am to speak on these matters that are so critical for the world if we are to ensure that our children and grandchildren are not compromised. The destination is not finance. It is the actual execution of projects. And if we're this close to the tipping point, then we need to act with urgency. Why? Because regrettably, the prospect of certain countries and regions becoming uninsurable and uninvestable is actually ahead of us. And that is the tipping point that we want to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You've been such a champion when it comes to these issues over this year, and I feel very proud to have had the chance to work with you, and I feel like I've learned so much over the months that we've engaged. I feel like I've been in a university for climate finance this year, and one of our professors has been Lord Stern, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Majid. Thank you, Dr. Sultan, for asking us to do this report. It's the Climate Finance Framework. It's the second round of work with an independent high-level expert group co-chaired by Vera Songway and myself. This report was written with Vera and myself, but particularly with Amar Bhattacharya and Eleanor Subaran. Eleanor is over here. But I thank you for asking us to do this. We feel that it's your report. You asked us to do it. We've stayed close to you. And of course it's our report, but we hope it's also your report. Thank you, Prime Minister Mottley, Mia, for your extraordinary leadership. As a professor at the London School of Economics, I can't resist saying that we are very proud of our alumna Prime Minister, Mia Mottley. And thank you, Professor Persaud Avi, for all your work on this, together with us on this report, as well as, of course, driving forward the Bridgetown Agreement. We have come a long way in the last year or so. If you look back to Bridgetown, to the Paris Summit, to President Ruto's initiative, Africa in September, to the World Bank IMF meetings in Marrakesh, where the report led by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers, and I was part of that, as was Vera, recommended some of the very similar things which I'm going to refer to today, and it was welcomed. Those of you who love international language will notice that welcome is an important word. It was welcomed by the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors, and it was welcomed by the heads of the MDBs themselves. And of course, on from Marrakesh to here, where on the first day we had the Leaders' Declaration on Finance, which was very important. It embodied some of the, really clearly, organically, we contributed to that, and that report was of real leadership. Altera, loss and damage, Green Climate Fund. This is a momentum that's building. But we really, really have to take it to scale, as Mia emphasized so clearly and strongly and correctly. I'm going to go very fast through this report. You can get your copy from Bob here, who's waving it, and you will read it carefully today or on the plane on the way home, or at least before you write your pieces. But we can answer questions if you want to do it more quickly. But there's a 1.5-page summary at the front. So why is the global stock stake so worrying? Well, it's clear, and Prime Minister Mottley has made it clear, we have not invested enough to make it happen. What do we need to make happen? An energy transition which is just, adaptation and resilience, loss and damage, and importantly, the conservation and restoration of nature. That's what we have to do, and we have to invest. How much do we have to invest? Well, we've argued, and careful work by geography and sector, that we have to invest something like $2.4 trillion a year in emerging markets and developing economies outside China. That's roughly 4 times by 2030, per annum, 2.4 trillion per annum by 2030, and of course go on increasing from there. That's roughly 4 times the investment in those areas now. Is it possible? Of course it is. It'd be 3, 4, 5 percentage points of GDP extra, but that, with a combination of domestic savings and external saving, is perfectly possible. And we have, as a world, been at higher investment rates in the past. But of course, support for that investment is absolutely vital. So that we start with what we have to do to deliver on Paris. So that when we talk about finance here, we're talking about finance with a purpose. The purpose is delivery on Paris. These are the investments we have to make in the areas I've described, on the scale I've described, to deliver on Paris, and then the finance is for those investments. It's not some number you pick out of the air and then negotiate down. This is a number that is necessary to deliver on Paris, finance that's necessary for those investments. The first thing, of course, is to unlock those investments. They don't take place because of people's perception of risk, in getting things done, in getting the revenues, but importantly they don't take place because the finance is not there to help reduce and manage and share that risk, including in the debt pause clauses. That's one example of reducing and sharing the risk that is necessary to unlock the investment. And some countries who are in deep debt positions are going to need help directly, and we hope the IMF can be in leadership position on that in tackling their debt issues. All that is necessary to unlock the investment, but it's possible, and it means the private sector, the MDBs, and the philanthropists, and the whole area of activity to get together, and of course critically the governments of the countries that create the conditions for investment. They all have to be in the same place, and they can't at the moment say, well look, we're ready, but we'll move when you get ready. We've got to get ready together and make it happen. And the private sector has to be in the room, the government, the MDBs, and of course civil society, philanthropists more broadly. There are 4 big areas of finance. Domestic resource mobilization, that is important, and countries can raise more money internally, but of course, for many, that will nowhere near be enough to deliver. The carbon taxation, getting rid of damaging subsidies. There are various ways internally to raise more resources. That's a big part of the story, but it cannot be the whole part of the story. And there's external private sector, where we argue that the finance should be multiplied by a factor of 15, so that they're a majority, small majority, but they're a majority of the finance. There's the MDBs, multilateral development banks, where the finance should be times 3. Here, we're absolutely together with the G20 expert group, which was put together at the request of Prime Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and chaired by N.K. Singh and Larry Summers. And as I said, Vera and I were part of that group. That's critical because the MDBs are in a position not only to reduce risk by their help with internal policies, but also to share the risk. And Prince Charles, sorry, I mustn't do that, King Charles, at his opening speech, I don't know how many kings speak about first loss offset. He was right. That's the kind of story you're talking about sharing and reducing risk. But also, that's not enough. Domestic resource mobilization, private sector, MDBs to help the private sector along. But also, we're going to need 5 times more of concessional or zero-cost finance. And the ODA is going to have to be a big part of rising to that, philanthropy, voluntary carbon markets. But I'm absolutely with Prime Minister Mottley. We're going to need some additional sources of revenue, which are essentially forms of international taxation or levies. In this case, where we're talking about climate change, I think the maritime and the oil and gas and the travel are of particular relevance to this issue. And that means countries getting together. It's not easy to levy an international tax. It means countries agreeing to make those taxes and agreeing together to make those taxes, and the resources are potentially enormous. So we can see what to do to increase the investment. It's got to be big. We can see what to do to increase the finance. And it's not just the total, it's how these different bits fit together to share and reduce the risk and thereby reduce the cost of capital, which is absolutely fundamental to getting this story done. Renewables need the capital up front. And this is the kind of thing that where the cost of capital is critical. What do we get if we get it right? We get the growth story of the 21st century. Much more efficient, cities where you can move and breathe, ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. The clean is already cheaper than the dirty across many areas of activity. But to get this, you've got to invest, you've got to have the conditions for investment, and you've got to have the finance for investment. But this is a route to something which is very different from the dirty, destructive models of the past, much more effective way of reducing poverty in a sustainable way. Success looks really good, as well as reducing fundamentally the terrible risks of climate change. Failure, as Prime Minister Mottley has described, looks really terrible. If we move anywhere near 2.5 or 3 degrees, we're talking about destruction of whole civilizations, people having to move hundreds of millions, perhaps billions. Let's be totally clear on the risks we face here if we fail. But let's not fail.
Lord Stern, thank you very much. I think we will be taking questions now.
Yeah,
unless Alexander, you wanted...
If you allow me, Ambassador?
Yes, please go ahead.
If you have questions, so please identify yourself, your name, your media organization, and please wait for the microphone to come. The gentleman here in the first row.
Good morning. My name is Sal Jafar. I am the CEO of ESG MENA, the first and only ESG knowledge hub in the MENA region. We're talking a lot of macro. If we can talk a bit of micro in terms of implementation of all your announcements with the banks and all that. Do you have any plan, or what is your plan to relay all your plans basically with the banks and all the financial institutions at the grassroots level, at the lower level basically? Thank you.
Let me try very quickly. The heads of the multilateral development banks welcomed the report of M.K. Singh and Larry Summers, which was built on a lot of the work which we had been doing for the first Songway Stone Bhattacharya report, which came from COP26, COP27. How do you do that tripling? It's a combination first of sweating the existing balance sheet rather more strongly, as was set out in the G20 Capital Adequacy Framework report. So they can take more risk through the resources that they already have. They, with the support of their shareholders, can do much more in the way of guarantees and equity, which have very powerful multiplier effects. And for some of this, they're going to need also, because those measures I described will not be enough to get the tripling, they're going to have to need their shareholders to stand by them and say, as you scale up, as you must, at some point soon, different times for different MDBs, you're going to need extra capital, and that we'll be there to back you with a capital increase. So we'll back you if you take more risk. If you take more risk, some projects are going to go down. That's in the nature of things. We'll back you. We'll back you with the extra capital. And also, there'll be some institutions, sovereign wealth funds, philanthropies, that can put in extra capital. We call it hybrid capital, which doesn't give you voting rights in those institutions, but is still very powerful. So those are very specific ways. This can be done. It's totally feasible, but it needs the leadership from the Multilateral Development Bank presidents. I hope we've got that. Let's make sure that we do and strengthen their resolve, but they've accepted that story. But it has to have the support of the shareholders. It has to have support of the shareholders in a strong enough way to convince the credit rating agencies because they have to be able to borrow at low rates on world markets. This is entirely practical and it's entirely feasible. Professor Persaud behind you has been working exactly on these things. So I think we're in a position to get on with it now.
The Prime Minister needs to leave soon. Is there a question for the Prime Minister? Yes, the lady in the second row.
Thank you. Hi, Kenza Bryan from the Financial Times. I wonder, Mia, what you think of all these carbon credit initiatives linked to emission reductions and Lord Stern as well. Are they effective finance-raising mechanisms, or do they create the risk of justifying further emissions in richer countries?
I think that the potential is there, but like with most things, without proper monitoring and effective compliance, we're not going to know what's happening. And there's not a sufficiently strong regulatory framework to deal with it because they're voluntary. So that, look, every which way I go, it keeps coming back to the same point. Political leadership. I said it in Glasgow, I repeat it now. Everything that needs to be done is actually capable of being done, as Lord Stern just said, but it requires leadership. If you're going to have shareholders behave differently from their reps, in one voice at COP, we hear one thing, and in another voice as shareholders in the financial institutions, we see another thing. There cannot be double speak at this point in time from countries. And why? We do not have the luxury of space and time. If we're going to be dealing with effective compliance of methane, then we need a global agreement that is capable of being enforced. If we're going to deal with carbon markets, then we need a mechanism that allows for effective regulation. So however which way I look at it, the missing entity is political leadership. And we don't have a single framework for that. But what I would like to suggest in the context of the financial component, that we use the convening power of the IMF, the World Bank, and the UNFCCC acting collectively together to begin to unravel some of these difficult issues that do require collective action.
I'd very much agree, but I'd like to add one point on how this could work better. And that is that if, on the voluntary carbon markets, a big firm could contribute a slice to a transition program, like a just energy transition framework. So if that program, it could be an Indian state, or it could be South Africa or Vietnam or whatever, says we're embarked on a major program which requires a lot of finance, a lot of investment. If you contribute some fraction of that, then you can regard some fraction of the emissions reductions associated with it as a credit. You're only doing it for your own reputation, right? It's not doing it compulsorily, it's voluntary, that's the key word. Why? Because people want the reputation and they don't want to buy duds, they don't want to buy fakes. So if you buy into a major programmatic transformation, the whole question of what would otherwise have happened if it hadn't have come is a very different one from if you're just buying into a particular project. And that's the spirit of the Energy Transition Accelerator, which John Kerry and others have followed. So there is actually a way forward which gives you the kind of scale. And if a country is investing, it's very difficult for it to sort of use as a country strategy flows which have just gone project by project into these particular things. So I think there's a way forward which actually is much less risky from the point of view of credibility and much more usable for a country in its development program. But for that to happen, as Mia said very clearly, you've got to have the leadership of the country to make the program and invite in.
The lady in the third row.
Megan Rowling from Thomson Reuters Foundation. My question is about gender, given that that was one of the main topics of the press conference. Mia, could you outline how you think there could be a gender justice element integrated into some of these plans? And Nick, I don't know if there is anything on the agenda for that. And also on adaptation, it will take years for some of these flows of finance to come through. Meanwhile, adaptation finance has not been going in the right direction. Is there a plan, like an emergency plan, to be able to get those funds to the ground where they're most needed right now? Thank you.
Very quickly, gender matters most at the individual level. And the reality is that too many of the things that we're trying to do are taking too long to benefit the people who is intended to benefit. The number of persons who are the victims of climate migration, you more and more see women emerging because they were the ones who may have stayed back to take care of families and to take care of homes. And the question is, how best can we help and target the assistance to those who are on the front line? If we can't get the macrofinance right, then we're not going to get it coming down, and countries will not have the fiscal space to give the support that they need to individuals who really need the help. Secondly, if we're going to change how we live and how we farm and how we move and all of the things about life that we've come to associate with a fossil fuel world, we're going to have to be able to do it at the level of families, which means that women's acceptance of the necessity for change is pivotal in order to be able to get that success. I'm not sure that there is much more gender lens that you can see at the macro level. It really is going to matter at the micro level, at the level of individuals. With respect to adaptation, I want to speak to this because, as I said, we're in danger of allowing the narrative on loss and damage to crowd out the importance that is absolutely still necessary for adaptation. At the end of the day, loss and damage is just that. It's after the event. What we want is to avert damage and avert losses before the event, which is why adaptation funding is critical. And that's why Lord Stearns and their recommendations as to how you scale up multilateral development banks and concessional funding and the other innovative ways to be able to deal with it are absolutely critical to us. And the problem is, however, that it is equally critical for us to spend money on education and healthcare and the other things, which is why we're saying that there can't be a false dichotomy. And I would hope, therefore, that the most important thing is for the world to change to from my perspective as head of government in a small state, two accepted principles. One, that you can use short-term money to finance development. It is not true. We saw what the UK had to do to be able to finance its own ability to survive World War I and to build back also from World War II. They needed long-term capital. It was a 100-year capital. Why do you believe that an industrial country in the early 20th century needed room to rebuild and long-term capital, but emerging market countries and developing countries today don't need it? It is a regrettable form of unconscious bias. And secondly, why do we continue to believe that we can have debt sustainability metrics anchored at 60% debt to GDP when that was appropriate for a world that saw one or two crises, but certainly not in a polycrisis world? And if we don't change that rapidly, it means that as we are speaking in this press conference, there are countries that are being told that their trajectory has to be a steep trajectory in order to come down to a debt to GDP ratio and metric that made sense in a pre-polycrisis world, but doesn't make sense now. Now, what does that mean? That as we most need to be spending the money, we don't have the fiscal space for it. It can't work. And countries need the fiscal space now to avert greater loss and damage, not just in climate, but in all other aspects of its development as we speak. And this was the COP that brought also climate and health to the table. Yeah. So we know the increased risk for pandemics as a result of what's happening with the climate.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions. So to stay in your words, Ambassador, thank you very much for this masterclass in climate finance. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you.